About 6 years ago, I worked as a winter caretaker for a hunting lodge in northern Minnesota. The lodge was remote, surrounded by thick woods and over 10 miles from the nearest town. It was the perfect setup for hunters during the season, but during the winter months, it was completely isolated. My job was to keep the place running, clear the snow, maintain the generator, and make sure the pipes didn't freeze. I'd always been fine with solitude, so the idea of being alone for weeks at a time didn't bother me. At least, that's what I told myself when I took the job. But there's one night that changed that for good. It was late February, and a massive snowstorm had rolled in. The wind was howling so loudly it sounded like the lodge might blow apart. By nightfall, the snow was piling up fast, and visibility outside was practically zero. I had the generator running and a fire going in the wood stove, and I'd just settled into the living room with a book when I heard it. A loud thump from the back of the lodge. I sat there listening. At first I thought it was snow sliding off the roof, but then it happened again. Thump. This time, it was louder. It wasn't the sound of snow. It was deliberate, like something or someone hitting the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the back door. I opened it just enough to shine the light outside. The cold was brutal, and the wind nearly ripped the door from my hand. That's when I saw them, deep, fresh footprints in the snow, leading up to the door. I stared at them, my heart pounding. Nobody else was supposed to be here. The nearest property was miles away, and there was no car, no snowmobile, just those prints, leading to the door and stopping. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but the tracks didn't continue. It was like whoever or whatever made them had vanished. I shut the door, locked it, and double-checked every window and door in the lodge. I told myself it could have been a lost hunter, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Why would someone come up to the lodge in the middle of a blizzard and not knock or call for help? And how did their tracks just stop? I went back to the living room, but I couldn't focus on my book anymore. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone looking in. The storm made it impossible to hear much of anything, but every so often, I thought I heard faint noises, like footsteps crunching in the snow. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I locked myself in one of the upstairs bedrooms and wedged a chair under the doorknob. I kept the hatchet I used for firewood within reach and sat in the dark, listening. That's when I heard it. Slow, deliberate creaking from the floorboards downstairs. My stomach dropped. Someone was inside the lodge. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet. The creaking was faint but steady, moving through the living room and toward the hallway. Whoever it was, they were taking their time, as if they knew I was there and were in no rush. Then I heard the sound of a doorknob rattling. Not my door, one of the other rooms down the hall. The rattling stopped, and I heard the floorboards creak again. They were getting closer. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to stay out of sight, when the handle of my door started to turn. I tensed, gripping the hatchet so hard my knuckles ached. The door didn't open. Whoever was on the other side must have realized it was barricaded. After a moment, the handle stopped moving, and I heard slow footsteps retreating down the hall. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in silence, listening to every creak and gust of wind. Around 4 a.m., I heard the faint sound of the back door opening and closing. I didn't move until daylight. When the sun finally came up, I stepped out of the room, my legs shaky and my heart still racing. The lodge was silent. but I could feel the cold draft from the back door. It was open, snow blowing in across the floor. The footprints outside were covered by fresh snow, but there was something new that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen table was a single object, my hunting knife. I always kept it in the bedroom with me, but there it was, lying in plain sight. Next to it was a piece of paper, folded in half. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 3 words. You were lucky. I packed my things and left that morning. I told the lodge owner what happened, but they didn't seem concerned. Probably just some local messing with you, they said. But the knife, the note, none of it added up. I've never gone back to that lodge, and I don't think I ever will. Whoever was out there that night wasn't lost. They knew exactly what they were doing. This happened to me 3 winters ago, when I was working for a towing company in Wyoming. My job involved responding to stranded vehicles, especially during bad weather. I was used to driving in heavy snow and whiteout conditions, but nothing could have prepared me for the call I got one night. It was mid-January, and a blizzard had rolled in fast. The roads were a nightmare. Thick ice hidden under fresh snow, and visibility was near zero. Around 8 p.m., just as I was about to call it a night, I got a call from dispatch. A car had slid off a desolate stretch of highway about 25 miles outside of town. The driver was stuck in a ditch and had called for help. They said it was urgent. The storm was getting worse and the temperature was dropping fast. I wasn't thrilled about going out in those conditions, but it was my job. I geared up, loaded the truck, and headed out. The drive was slow and tense, with the wind battering the truck and snow piling up faster than the plows could clear it. After about 40 minutes, I spotted the car, an older sedan, half buried in snow at the bottom of a shallow ditch. I pulled over and shined my headlights on the car. The windows were frosted over, but I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. I parked, grabbed my flashlight, and trudged through the snow to the car. I knocked on the driver's side window, but the person inside didn't react. I knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the driver, a man in his 40s, rolled down the window just enough to speak. "You here to help?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I said. "You okay? Been out here long?" He nodded, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. His face was pale and his hands were trembling, even though the heater in the car was on full blast. I figured he was just in shock from the cold. "All right," I said. "Sit tight. I'll hook up your car and pull you out." As I walked back to the truck, I noticed something odd. There was another set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the car and into the woods. The snow was fresh, so they had to be recent, but the driver hadn't mentioned anyone else being with him. I thought about asking, but the wind was brutal, and I just wanted to get the job done. I hooked up the car and started pulling it out of the ditch. It didn't take long, and once the car was back on the road, I went back to let the driver know he was good to go. But when I got to the car, it was empty. The engine was still running, and the driver's door was wide open. I shined my flashlight around, calling out into the storm, but there was no sign of him. The only thing I found were the same footprints I'd noticed earlier, leading from the car to the tree line. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. I grabbed my phone and called dispatch to let them know what was going on. They told me to hang tight while they contacted the authorities. I waited in my truck, keeping an eye on the car and the woods, but the snow was so heavy I couldn't see more than a few feet. About 10 minutes later, I saw movement in the headlights. A figure emerged from the woods, stumbling through the snow. It was the driver. His coat was gone and his shirt was ripped, but the look on his face was what terrified me the most. He looked panicked, like he'd seen something that shouldn't exist. I jumped out of the truck and ran to him. "What happened?" I asked. "Are you hurt?" He grabbed my arm and whispered, "He's still out there." I froze. "Who?" I asked. He didn't answer, just kept repeating, "He's still out there! He's still out there!" Before I could press him further, he passed out. I dragged him into my truck, cranked the heat, and locked the doors. My heart was racing as I scanned the woods with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything. The sheriff arrived about 30 minutes later. By then, the storm had eased up a bit, and they were able to search the area. They didn't find anyone else, but they did find something that still gives me chills. Another set of footprints in the snow, circling the man's car and leading back into the woods. Whoever or whatever had been out there was watching us the whole time. The driver recovered at the hospital, but he refused to talk about what happened that night. He left town a few days later, and nobody I've talked to since has been able to explain what I saw. I still work for the towing company, but I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes, or the words he kept repeating. This happened to me and two of my closest friends, Alex and Dan, last December. We'd planned a weekend trip to a remote cabin in upstate New York to relax, drink, and unwind before the chaos of the holidays. The cabin belonged to Dan's uncle, who let us use it whenever we wanted, as long as we left it clean. We knew a snowstorm was coming, but we didn't think much of it. We were prepared with plenty of food, firewood, and even a backup generator in case we lost power. It sounded perfect. 3 friends snowed in, with no work, no stress, and nothing but time to kill. The first night was uneventful. We cooked steaks on the wood stove, played cards, and stayed up late drinking. By the next morning, the snow was coming down hard. It wasn't a big deal at first. We spent the day inside, watching movies on Dan's laptop and joking about how we were off the grid. Around sunset, Alex and I decided to go outside to shovel a path to the shed where the firewood was stored. The wind was brutal, and the snow was already waist-deep in some places. As we worked, I glanced at the tree line and noticed something strange. There were faint tracks leading from the forest toward the cabin. "Hey, Alex," I called. "You see those tracks?" He stopped shoveling and looked where I was pointing. "Probably a deer or something," he said. But when we got closer, we realized they weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, deep ones, spaced far apart, like whoever made them was running. We followed the tracks to the edge of the woods, but they disappeared into the trees. Alex shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness I felt. Why would someone be running out here in the middle of a blizzard? We went back inside and told Dan, but he just laughed. "Probably a hiker who got caught in the storm," he said. "It's not like anyone's breaking in out here." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't stop thinking about the tracks. Something didn't feel right. That night, after we'd all gone to bed, I woke up to a faint noise. It was hard to hear over the wind, but it sounded like scraping. I sat up listening. It was coming from outside, near the front door. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 3:14 a.m. I hesitated, then got up and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside, and my stomach dropped. There was a man standing on the porch. He was facing the door, his back to me, wearing a heavy coat and a hood. In his hand, he held a long object, something thin, maybe a crowbar or a metal rod. I froze, my heart pounding. The wind was howling, but I could still hear the faint scrape, scrape, scrape as he dragged the object along the porch railing. I backed away from the window and woke up Alex and Dan, whispering what I'd seen. At first, they didn't believe me, but when Alex peeked out the window and saw the man for himself, his face went pale. "What do we do?" Dan asked, keeping his voice low. "We lock everything," I said. Then we wait. We turned off the lights and locked all the doors and windows, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The scraping noise stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the wind. Then there was a loud bang on the front door. We all froze. The banging came again, harder this time, like he was trying to break the door down. I grabbed a fire poker from the hearth. Alex grabbed a kitchen knife, and Dan armed himself with a baseball bat he'd brought for fun. We stood in the dark, hearts racing, waiting to see what would happen. The banging stopped. For a long time there was silence, and I started to think maybe he'd left. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps on the roof. Dan whispered, "How the hell did he get up there?" We didn't have time to answer. There was a loud crash as something hit one of the upstairs windows. Alex bolted upstairs to check it out, while Dan and I stayed by the front door, weapons in hand. A moment later, Alex came running back down. "He broke the window," Alex said, out of breath. "I think he's inside." We barricaded ourselves in the living room, piling furniture against the doors and windows. The wind masked most of the noise, but every so often we'd hear creaks and thuds from somewhere in the house. We stayed awake all night, clutching our makeshift weapons, waiting for him to come for us. By morning, the storm had eased, and the light of dawn filtered through the snow-covered windows. We cautiously opened the door to find the porch and yard littered with footprints. They circled the cabin, leading to the broken window and back out into the woods. The man was gone, but he'd left something behind. Stuck to the front door with a hunting knife was a piece of paper. On it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "You can't stay hidden forever." We packed up and left that morning, abandoning the cabin and cutting the trip short. Dan's uncle called the police, but they didn't find anyone. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. All I know is, if we hadn't barricaded ourselves in, things could have ended very differently.